Hi everyone, my name's Lauren and my PhD research is about the servants and the estate community at Chatsworth in the 19th century. So today I'm going to be telling you a story about a Victorian family beginning in the year 1820, when a young couple of newlyweds named Thomas and Hannah Wright arrived at a village that you've already heard about this evening, the village of Edensor. They arrived 20 years before the new model village that you can see today was built, but Edensor was quite different to the village that James Lowton and his family lived in 100 years earlier. A couple of new houses had been built, the Devonshire Arms pub had been demolished, the inn had been moved from the River Derwent to the entrance of the park, so that's the inn that James Lowton had been kept in, and the vicarage had been demolished. And this was part of landscaping works that took place under the management of Lancelot Capability Brown and the 4th Duke at the end of the 18th century. But despite these changes, Edensor was still quite a large village in 1820, with around 500 inhabitants who were crowded into the low thatched cottages and ramshackle stone houses. Thomas and Hannah Wright don't appear on the rental accounts, so they probably lodged with one of the cottagers, and this would have made for quite cramped conditions when shortly after their arrival, Hannah gave birth to a little boy who they called John. It must have been an exciting time for the family. Thomas, in the tradition of his father's family, was a stonemason, and it might have been while travelling to learn his trade that he met Hannah in Norfolk, which was a long way from Thomas's hometown of Chesterfield in Derbyshire. They had returned to Derbyshire in 1820 and to the village of Edensor because large building works were about to begin at Chatsworth. The young 6th Duke of Devonshire, who inherited his father's estate in 1811, had decided to demolish the untidy service buildings at the side of his house and to build a grand new north wing, which, as well as a new kitchen, servants' bedrooms, a servants' hall and laundry, was to contain a ballroom, sculpture gallery, library and dining room in which he could entertain and impress his guests. Thomas Wright was one of around 350 masons and labourers who were brought in to build this extension, and it would have been a great addition to his CV. Sadly, however, tragedy struck in 1824. Thomas and Hannah's little boy John died at the age of 3 and was buried in the churchyard at Edensor. The pain felt by his parents is evident in the poem that Thomas carved into the gravestone of his son. It reads, "Sweet prattling child, to all our hearts most dear, long shall we bathe thy memory with a tear. Farewell, too promising on earth to dwell, sweetest of fondlings, best of babes, farewell." 2 years after the sad death of their little boy, Thomas and Hannah had another son, whom they christened William Sherwood Wright. He was born in 1826 and therefore arrived at Chatsworth in the same year as a man called Joseph Paxton, who would go on to transform the gardens at Chatsworth and to help rebuild the village in which William was born. Paxton would become famous in 1851, as some of you might know, as the architect of the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park. William Sherwood and his parents might also have met a man called Peter Wisternoff, a coachman that the 6th Duke had brought in from Russia, who had a huge bushy beard, something that was quite alien in England at the time. The Wright family would also have been acquainted with Hannah Gregory, the long-reigning housekeeper at Chatsworth, who worked there for about 50 years. And they might also have crossed paths with Robert Meynell, the Duke's travelling valet, who would later be dismissed for visiting a brothel in London while in charge of the Duke's dog. When the north wing at Chatsworth was completed, Thomas, Hannah and little William moved back to Chesterfield, where Thomas had grown up, to set up his own mason's shop just down the road from his father. After a short life of heavy labour, Thomas died at the age of 35, but his descendants carried on the masonry business that he had started. His son, William Sherwood, married a remarkable lady called Amy. They ran the business together in the mid-19th century. When Amy was widowed in 1872, she posted an advert in the local newspapers to announce that she was carrying on the masonry business herself. It said, "Mrs. Wright respectfully informs the public that the business of builder and mason carried on by her late husband will be continued at the above address as before." In subsequent years, she personally carved a font for a church at Temple Normanton, and in 1879 she won a bid to design the new Masonic Lodge in Chesterfield, which still stands today. In the 1881 census, Amy is recorded as a master builder, and 12 years later, at the age of 65, Amy put an advert in the newspaper in which she called herself a builder and monumental mason, specialising in crosses and headstones in granite, marble and stone. Even in the 21st century, I think we would regard a 65-year-old female builder as a bit of an eccentric, let alone in provincial Victorian Derbyshire. Amy and William Sherwood's 9 children worked as musicians, hat makers, confectioners, dressmakers, and of course, stonemasons. One of their daughters, Maud, started a new occupational trend in the family as a school teacher in the 1880s. Unfortunately, the art of masonry did eventually die out as a Wright family profession, although some of the men went into related professions such as architecture. But education continued to employ the women of the family for several decades, even after they moved out of Derbyshire. In the 1960s, Margaret Jennifer Wright would train to become a teacher in Northamptonshire, working her way up to the position of head teacher. Her daughter Lisa also went into education and worked as a teacher of a teacher of children with special needs in America. In fact, she still does work as a teacher in America. Lisa's daughter is currently doing a PhD in servants and the estate community at Chatsworth in the 19th century. That person, as I'm sure you've guessed, is me. My grandmother's maiden name was Wright, and I am the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Thomas and Hannah Wright, who arrived at Chatsworth around the year 1820. However, this is not the story of how I came to choose my research. The reason that I'm interested in the estate community at Chatsworth, in Peter Wisnoff, the Russian coachman, Hannah Gregory, the housekeeper, the villagers of Edensor, and so on, is not because my ancestors lived there. In fact, I didn't know any of this information when I applied to the project. It's actually a complete coincidence that I now work in Chatsworth in the part of the building that my ancestor helped build. And that many of the people I spend my days researching are buried within meters of John Wright, the little boy who, if he had lived, would have grown up to be a stonemason like his father and his younger brother William. It's a coincidence that my great-great-great-grandfather was born at Edensor in the year that Joseph Paxton, the head gardener, arrived at Chatsworth, whose letters I've been reading and writing about for the last year and a half. I didn't even find out about my family connection to Chatsworth in the archives there. I made this discovery a few months ago, crouched over my desk at home late at night with a hot chocolate, feeding my Ancestry.com addiction. You can imagine my amazement and disbelief when I connected my grandfather's father's direct ancestral line, which had been forgotten in the family, to the grave of a little boy in the churchyard at Edensor. Once I knew this information, however, I wasn't exactly sure what to do with it. It seemed somehow inappropriate and a bit self-indulgent to incorporate it into my academic research. It's only very recently that historians have started to accept family history and tracing their own family trees as a legitimate methodology. Alison Light's book, Common People, has been groundbreaking in this regard, tracing Professor Light's own Victorian ancestors in order to investigate the lives of the working classes in 19th century England. I've always thought of family history, of going back through the census and creating these digital trees as something of a guilty pleasure, a hobby that was quite separate from my work. Tracing back your family tree is a bit like historical reenactment. Lots of historians do it, or wish they did it, but no one really likes to admit it. Incidentally, I took part in the 200-year anniversary reenactment of the Battle of Waterloo, and it was awesome. At an early stage, you're taught that historians are supposed to be impartial observers who don't get involved or allow personal feelings to interfere with their writing. I also worried that family history might be a time-consuming distraction. My research, as you can imagine, invites a lot of public interest, and many amateur family historians have written to ask if I've come across their ancestors in the archives at Chatsworth. Despite my reservations about family trees and stories that begin with my great-great-great-grandfather, my extracurricular interest in family history and my PhD research have become increasingly entwined. inquiries from the public and the lives of my own ancestors have led me towards exciting topics that I might otherwise never have considered, such as servants and facial hair, the labour of widows who continued their husbands' trades after their deaths, and the experiences of English servants travelling abroad, or of foreign servants coming to England to work in the houses of the aristocracy. Likewise, my academic research has taught me more about making family histories meaningful. My knowledge about my ancestors, Thomas and Hannah Wright, is made much more colourful and valuable by the picture that I've built up of the community that they lived in and the families and individuals that surrounded them. So what I've learnt is that family history research, both my own and others, is not only a hobby or a distraction, it's also a great way to get the public engaged with wider historical issues and events, and it's an opportunity for me, as a historian, to approach my topic from new angles in a way that makes me even more enthusiastic and invested in my own research. Thank you.